and WHO people, but also the WHO colleagues from the different departments, region, and country offices. So welcome, welcome. You may know that WHO has a goal that 1 billion more people are enjoying better health and well-being. This goal provides important opportunity to step up our efforts toward making population healthier now and the future. At least 50% of the global disease burden could be prevented by reducing risk through promoting health and creating supportive society, including sustainable food system. COVID-19 has highlighted how fragile the world food system are. They are dangerously undermining our future health and well-being. The health impact of the food system also interact with climate change and environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. Our vision for healthy population is a world where all people enjoy healthy lives and well-being, living a healthy, safe, and supportive environment as a member of an inclusive society. WHO has embarked into the process of developing a global health narrative for sustainable food system and to contribute to the UN Food System Summit 2021. Today's webinar is the fourth in a series of the conversation with experts, partners, and WHO staffs. So I would like to share with you some key points from the previous webinars. First, we learned about the need to better define health and well-being and the potential role of WHO in the needed transformation of our food system. Second, we have heard about the importance of developing an adapted food system framework that fully integrates all dimensions of people's health and well-being. Third, we also discuss the need to be broad in scope with the systems approach and still being granular by considering outcomes, geographical differentiation, and the specific vulnerability of selected population group. And fourth, furthermore, we reflected on WHO role in identifying evidence-based solution and to inspire national actions, including through forthcoming high-level forum like UN Food System Summit and the second half of the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition. Today's webinar will be contribute to the ongoing process in WHO to build the global health narrative inherent in sustainable food system. We have the great pleasure to have again Professor Webb is with us. Thank you, Webb, for your time. We will present the key finds and recommendations from the recently published Foresight 2 reports, Future Food System for People, Our Planet, and Prosperity. Great name. So for the global panel on the agriculture and the food system of nutrition. So dear colleagues, I will count on you with your engagement and contribution to the discussion. So I look forward to discuss with you today. Thank you very much. So up to Francesco.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Yamamoto. And again, welcome to all participants. You're listening to the webinar on the future of food systems for people, our planet, and prosperity. Speaking to you is Francesco Branca, the Director of the Department of Nutrition and Food Safety in WHO. But before I go to the main presentation, I'd like to inform that this event will be recorded. So please let us know if you don't want this to happen. The link to the recording will be available on the WHO website. Please keep your microphones muted, and of course the speakers will then unmute themselves when they're bound to speak. For the Q&A, could people please use the chat function, and I'll be asking questions to the relevant panel members. So without further ado, let me then give the floor to Professor Patrick Webb, who is being the technical advisor to the global panel on Agriculture and Food System and Nutrition, and Alexander McFarlane, Professor of Nutrition at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Branca, and also Dr. Yamamoto, ADG. It's an honor and a pleasure, obviously, to be here with you. Let me start by commending WHO for having a series like this, linking these important issues with a view to informing a global narrative on the linkages among health, climate, environment, and food systems. And to have a group of experts within the unit, within WHO, dealing with those very important linkages between climate and health, but we're here to focus on that dimension that links those two, which is food systems. I am about to share my screen. So what I'd like to do is very briefly share with you some of the bigger insights that hopefully can help not just WHO, but WHO and partners help not just define and refine its own narrative, but to influence the upcoming UN Food Systems Summit and the Nutrition for Growth Summit, both happening next year, but importantly to help national governments play their part in this too. This report, the work of the Global Panel for many years, has been primarily focused on informing and supporting and making recommendations to governments, primarily in low and middle income countries, the policymakers, the analysts, the business people, the civil society, and so on. But clearly, there's a lot of help needed, a lot of capacity to build. And a lot of these issues that we're talking about in this report, the second Foresight report, have global repercussions, right? It's not just things that actions needed at a local and a national level, but the global ramifications of these issues are quite clear. The basis, I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining the justification for placing diets at the core of this dialogue, but the essence is, at this point, the costs associated with diet-related disease, on the global burden of disease, the malnutrition in all its forms, and the natural environment, climate change as well as soil degradation, water depletion, and so on, is huge and getting huger every day that we don't take action to reverse a lot of the processes that are involved. So we need to really distill the argument based on science and focus that argument on appropriate actions. Things were bad even before the COVID pandemic, but in fact, the pandemic has brought the nexus of human health, environmental fragility, and food really to the fore, with more people in poverty, unable to afford food, a serious reversal of gains, but also modeling work that suggests perhaps even a 25% increase in things like child wasting, but especially the diet-related NCDs that are presenting as underlying risk factors for the severity of how COVID plays out. So what we eat, exposure to disease, and the environment, the food system which generates the food, our dietary choices, are key. How this report differs from others. There's many reports out there. What we're trying through this report is to bring together, distill the best science, but especially to ram home the argument that dietary patterns, what people choose to eat or are unable to eat, dietary patterns are key determinants, they're drivers simultaneously of human and planetary ill health. Therefore, that has to be shifted around to become solutions to both human and planetary health. Diets are shaped by choice. choice at all levels, not just consumer choice, but what choice of businesses, what they invest in, what they choose to market and how, government choices on where to invest R&D, what trade tariffs, what things to put tariffs on. Everyone is making choices that shape and frame and influence diets. A lot of economic incentives and political incentives are involved in that. Incentives and choices are modifiable risk factors. They can be changed. That is the premise of this report. And while there's been a huge amount of effort focused on the word transformation, our food systems need radical transformation. Many people have called for this, but transformation is an aspiration, it's a goal, it's the destination. This report focuses on the realities of the steps, the transition steps that governments and businesses and individuals need to take to get us to a transformed food system. So that's really it. We're focusing on some of the realities. Of course, there's a lot focused on the production and trade and processing and transformation of food. We have to shift agricultural investments in research to prioritize nutrient-rich foods in ways they did not. We have to shift subsidies and taxes and reduce food and waste. All of that is essential, but I'm not going to focus too much on that side of things today. We need to build in the global health narrative, we need to build in the crucial issue of making healthy, sustainable diets affordable to everyone as a health priority, human health priority. Health must not and cannot be left to one side of this issue. In the food systems discussion, there's a lot of discussion about sustainability, about climate change, about environmental degradation. Most presentations, including mine in a second, would start with saying how human health suffers. But we need to emphasize how actions to improve human health are part of the solution. We need transparent, evidence-informed discussion of the realities, the trade-offs, the actionable entry points that can make a difference. That's where we start. Now, as I said, we know that the generation of different foods, different food groups, that means the production and how they are produced, the choice of what foods, the choice of technologies used to produce them, have a range of environmental impacts, and that our evidence on that is growing. Food systems are very important, we know that, not just agriculture, but transformation, the energy used, the transportation, account for a large share of global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not just that. Blue water use, what we see here is staple crops, very much a significant user of water. Much of those staple crops are grains that go to feed livestock. So we have to understand how the choice of grains is impacting our water consumption. The application of nitrogen, over application, some would argue, which generates nitrous oxide, has other spill-off effects. As you see, fruits and vegetables, nutrient-rich foods we want people to eat, are a significant demander of that. Legumes play a role. They are a significant, I seem to have lost my, sorry, I've gone the wrong direction. Legumes and green are important in phosphorus. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, obviously we all know that animal products, animal source foods of a variety of kinds play the greatest role. There's my legumes family. In other words, choices around food, what to grow, how to grow it, how to produce it, and what it's used for, whether human consumption or animal consumption or something else, brewing beer is a particular favorite of mine, all have a choice. All have a range of impacts. And what we're seeing is that by letting go, by not understanding this and reframing the choices around diets, we're seeing damage on a vast scale. Most countries are not going to meet the World Health Assembly targets from 2012, and we can see the NCD impacts on public health. escalating dramatically fast in low and middle income countries as well. Malnutrition in all its forms, that's undernutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, and diet-related chronic diseases, are becoming a huge burden, a growing burden, societally, economically, and politically. We have to do something about this. What we're seeing is that something like diabetes is growing like wildfire across South Asia, as well as East Asia, Pacific, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. These issues are coming to the forefront of many health systems, actually threatening to bankrupt those health systems in many cases, where the pre-existing conditions of undernutrition and micronutrient deficiencies were still there. And our diets are not static. They are changing rapidly in many areas and negatively in many cases. I won't deal a lot, this comes from the Global Nutrition Report, but this is consumption of different types of foods or ingredients against WHO levels, the target or optimal level being where the arrow looks. So what you see for different groupings of countries, nuts and seeds and milk consumed at far, far less than they should be in low income, lower middle income, even high income countries in some cases. Omega-3 fatty acids in high income countries potentially exceeding desirable levels, but far below for low and middle income countries. Interesting, low income countries are doing reasonably well in legume consumption, but on a daily per capita basis. Other countries not so well. The problem, one of the great problems, as you well know in this audience, is sodium and sugar-sweetened beverage consumption off the scale in the wrong direction for basically all parts of the world. And this doesn't have to be this way. We are seeing this is change in the consumption of ultra-processed drinks and foods, and we're seeing negative change, which means positive gains. In Western Europe and North America, Australasia, a reduction in ultra-processed drink products, even ultra-processed foods in some parts of the region. But across the rest of the world, large increases in consumers turning to these products. So we have to make the change feasible and desirable. I mentioned earlier on the cost of a nutritious diet, nutrient adequacy being at the core here. Recent estimates, the FAO just put out the figure that 3 billion people today cannot afford a minimally nutritionally adequate diet based on today's dietary patterns and today's food prices country by country. And of course, those most effective, you can see, are in a swath across the tropics, low and middle income countries in particular. 3 billion people today unable to afford a healthy diet. Now, changing that isn't just a matter of reducing the cost of foods. It's about changing consumer demand to increase production of those foods, and also pro-poor growth, equitable growth that increases purchasing power of poor people in those low and middle income countries. So I urge you, I sincerely encourage everyone to read this report. It's a long report, but it does contain a lot of very valuable information. And I should have said it at the beginning, that Francesco Branca played a very important role in calibrating a lot of the information in here. In particular, I would emphasize that you go to section 3, which is all about the transition and the action steps needed. And what we've put some of those action steps, some of those priority policy actions here, not all of them, but are in 4 quadrants, that an action is needed across all 4 quadrants of the food system to make it possible for us to achieve sustainable, healthy diets as the transformation goal. WHO and its partners, health systems in developing countries, all have a key role to play here. Desirability, I've mentioned it several times. If we don't influence what people want to eat, then there is a challenge in everything else across the food system in generating the nutrient-rich, nutrient-dense foods that we want them to eat. If they're not there, if they're not affordable, they're not accessible, then of course people won't want them. But even if they are, if they have not been encouraged to want those, to make choices that are informed, then there is going to be a challenge. We need a lot of work on upgrading the science about what is a healthy diet. We're not proposing a single diet. This is not a Lancet series position. We want local choice to be appropriately framed by evidence. Food-based dietary guidelines need to be updated, they need to be upgraded, they need to be made policymaker facing, not just consumer facing. We have to understand how the behavioral nudges, the advertising and marketing, and the principles of engagement with the private sector to achieve desirability of healthy diets. Those diets have to be affordable. I mentioned we need to increase the purchasing power. We need to consider taxation and subsidies on key foods. We've seen examples, positive examples in Mexico and Chile and elsewhere, but in low and middle income countries generally, not enough experience and not enough evidence of what works and what could work in these areas. Those foods that are affordable and desirable have to be accessible. That means cutting food loss and waste and using all mechanisms, including trade, to bridge gaps, to fill holes in the supply of these foods. And of course, those foods have to be available in the first place, which means a relative shift in emphasis globally as well as nationally in terms of the kinds of foods that we choose to produce. Do they match what we want as global public health outcomes? Right now, the answer is not really. How do we do that? Well, through a lot of mechanisms. We did some modeling activities as part of this report, looked at what would happen if you, for example, did high rapid pro-poor growth, cut food loss and waste by 50%, and improved the sustainability, the full cost accounting of production systems. And by 2050, we actually, surprisingly to us, found that a shift towards a more flexitarian diet, this is not a vegetarian diet, a flexitarian diet, actually could make a healthy, sustainable diet much more affordable to most parts of the world, including low and middle income countries, by 2050. That is very positive. That means we need to do a lot more work in this kind of arena of modeling what can be done and how to get there. The how to get there, of course, is the first challenge, the first thing a minister is going to ask. Well, okay, so what do I do? Transformation is not easy. We are not shying away from that in the report. There are important trade-offs, political as well as constituency trade-offs as well as economic. The role of human health in shaping diets has to be at the front. People have to understand it, promote the role of health, and promote the lens of health when discussing these trade-offs across the food system. A new vision at national level has to be there, and it has to be embraced at all levels within the country, and health has to be one of the entry points for doing that. We also, though, have to accept the limitations, the physical policy development capacity, the analytical capacity in low and middle income countries, which is rather limited in many cases. We have to try and build that capacity. When you think about health risks in terms of disease risks per DALYs per 100,000 population and climate risks, you cluster the number of countries where those risks are high in both quadrants. You have a lot of countries with a high number of people who need a lot of help to find the right policies, the right steps to transition in the right direction. Food-based dietary guidelines, I mentioned, I want to emphasize that right now, there's literally not one country in the world whose food-based dietary guidelines are consistent with what is produced and traded and consumed in those countries, let alone with Paris Accord agreements or other sustainable development, environmental development targets that have been set by those goals. So that's got to change. Advertising and marketing, we always pivot to this because that's part of the desirability equation. Much more needs to be done to figure out what could be done, what isn't yet being done, not just in regulating advertising and marketing, but in promoting informed choice around healthy diets. So finally, coming to the last couple of slides, health sector stakeholders, what can they do? It's not just that they must not be siloed. Health people, health sectors, health ministries must be front and center in this food system dialogue. They have to be part of the issue of trade-offs, the discussion of trade-offs, the policy distortions and incoherence that are very common in low and middle income countries, where you have a public health goal, but you have an agricultural production policy and potentially a trade policy that simply do not match. They are incoherent. They butt heads in terms of what they do and what they can achieve. Greater understanding of that policy incoherence and resolving those challenges, those trade-offs, is crucial. We need multi-win targets that are going to be attractive to multiple constituencies. Policies can't just achieve sustainability, just health, just poverty reduction. We need to find entry points where we can shape the dialogue, shape the narrative about multi-wins, where human health, planetary health, and all other SDG goals are taken into account. We need to find what existing or planned interventions that can be made food system friendly through the lens of both human and planetary health. We need to understand not just what are the health services, but what are the services and goods and information and resources across all public sector actions that can be brought together and articulate multiple gains in these domains. And then finally, we need to support national, but also intergovernmental and global initiatives that help us not just to understand health dimensions separate from nutrition dimensions, separate from planetary goals. We need to bring consensus around the scientific evidence at the interface of the human and planetary challenges. We need ways to facilitate science to policy translation that connects the dots, helps people understand how to prioritize policies that offer us multi-wins. And part of that is around the true costing of food, the understanding the externalities, not just from an environmental and climate perspective, but from a human health and health delivery and health budget perspective. The true costing of food goes beyond how much water you use. It goes very much to the dimension of how health is impacted and what health can do for this brain. So in conclusion, we've got to, in engaging, embracing a food systems lens, we've got to challenge the fragmented approach that is typical in policymaking and investment, not just at a public level, but among companies. Focus on quality of diets, the affordability of those diets, and the generation and desirability of those diets. We've got to tackle, we can't deny or hide, the economic and political incentives that often lead those policies and those investments in the wrong direction. We've got to embrace the transition steps and embrace the challenge that they carry with them. There are going to be costs. There are going to be winners and losers. The articulation of the gains, the benefits, has to be quite clear. Reshaping the food environment is key. It's obviously a domain where health comes in explicitly, but health matters throughout this food system agenda. And basically, we all have to find a way to communicate and find the transition solutions that low and middle income countries in particular, but all countries in the world can adopt to help us get to the goal that we so much desire. Thank you, and I will hand back over to Francesco.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, Patrick, for this very illuminating summary of such an excellent report. And you really called our attention to the cost to health, nutrition, and the natural environment of unfit food systems. You then said that there are priority actions that we could take on availability, accessibility, affordability, and desirability of the diet. But we have to manage the transition. And this is actually something I found, particularly original and of the report. We don't always talk about the how. The report goes into that and particularly calls the attention to the need to have coherent actions across the systems and to be transparent about the trade-offs. We need to understand what we are sacrificing, and we shouldn't sacrifice health. That's what often happens. You told us about how to engage health sector stakeholders, and I hope we can address that point in our discussions. But now I actually would like to call a discussant to the report, and this is Dr. Cristina Romanelli. Cristina is a colleague here in WHO. She's technical officer with the WHO Environment, Climate Change and Health Department, but she's been very much involved in the joint work program Biodiversity and Health since its establishment in 2012. Cristina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Francesco. It's such a pleasure to join you all in this important conversation, and it really is an honor to follow Dr. Yamamoto and Professor Webb's outstanding summary of this vast and deeply complex global challenge, rooted in a largely broken global food system that perpetuates these cycles of malnutrition, poverty, and diet-related morbidity and mortality. And I also really want to commend the authors of the report for the holistic vision that was presented here today. As Dr. Webb indicated in his presentation, the costs of the status quo to the global economy and societies is absolutely huge. The Foresight report estimates that the cost to health, nutrition, and environment from failing food systems is $12 trillion every single year, and is projected to rise considerably in coming decades under business as usual scenarios. What a striking figure that is. If there's a message I'd like to reinforce here today to turn the tide, is that every single one of us, regardless of our role within the health sector, have a huge responsibility in the necessary transformation of the food system. This means we have to work and engage across the three pillars of sustainable development, social, economic, and environmental, in tandem, and adopt a systems lens to consider every step of the food production and consumption chain from farm to fork. I'd also like to take a brief moment to emphasize that third pillar, the environmental determinants of health, including biodiversity loss and climate change, which are interlinked with food systems and diet-related health outcomes, precisely to transcend that siloed response. In this light, I really applaud the Foresight report for linking food systems to planetary boundaries, several of which are dangerously close to tipping points with potentially disastrous consequences. So how linked are they exactly? Let's just think about this. Of an estimated 6,000 species cultivated for food over time, only 200 today play a significant role in food production nationally, regionally, or globally, and only 9 species account for 66% of total crop production. Most strikingly still, today only 3 staple crops, wheat, rice, maize, provide over 50%, over half of the world's calories derived from plants. This means that our genetic food basket clearly is narrowing, and along with it, the diversity of nutrient-rich foods that keep us healthy. At the same time, our landscapes are becoming increasingly homogeneous. Industrial agricultural fields are now routinely injected with pesticides and nitrogen fertilizers and other nutrients that both directly and indirectly impact human health, contaminating and depleting our soils, freshwater, oceans, and air, and ultimately the food we all consume to survive. At the same time, industrial agriculture and livestock production also contribute to about 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and a large shift to the flexitarian diets, of which we were referring to before, would mitigate the associated climate threat while also improving health outcomes. At the same time, land use change is eroding biodiversity at absolutely unprecedented rates. And it's the single greatest environmental driver of new infectious disease outbreaks. So we need to be smart about agricultural expansion as well. These drivers are clearly compromising quality, safety, and access to nutritious foods. Let's not forget that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, unhealthy diets were responsible for over 11 million premature adult deaths annually. The majority, again, amongst the most vulnerable populations. Last year alone, more than 1 in every 4 people either experienced hunger or didn't have access to nutritious and sufficient diets. And after COVID-19 wreaked havoc worldwide, food insecurity and all forms of malnutrition and diet-related NCDs have seen a sharp rise, including among children, our most vulnerable, with an estimated 10,000 additional child deaths every single month from malnutrition associated with COVID-19 alone. And those estimates came before we entered this second wave of the pandemic. So the point is that while the challenge is great, the opportunity we have here, the opportunity for the health community is even greater. We now have a common platform and a common agenda, which are the Sustainable Development Goals. We now have a UN Decade of Action on Nutrition till 2026. We now have a Food Systems Summit that can help us to define that narrative and really catalyze cross-sectoral action. In the health sector, thankfully, we also have a vision and a dedicated plan of action moving forward, which is the WHO Manifesto for a Healthy, Green, and Just Recovery, and an initial series of actionables to support its fulfillment. The manifesto really does provide an essential blueprint through its 6 prescriptions, spanning across the SDGs, spanning across its pillars for sustainable development. And in addition, for instance, to its calls for safeguarding nature as the foundation for human health, investing in essential services such as clean water and sanitation, supporting a clean energy transition and healthy systems, cities rather, and a decarbonization of the economy, its 4th prescription focuses very specifically on promoting healthy and sustainable food systems to reduce social vulnerability and promote resilience in the face of future socioeconomic and environmental shocks. So I leave you with this important, what I think is message of hope and call to action for health leadership for a truly transformative whole of government and whole of society approach to achieve sustainable and healthy diets and food systems. And I look forward to this discussion.
Christina, thank you very much. And we do need these messages of hope indeed. You mentioned that, in reality, that the challenges are even bigger. The one on biodiversity is another critical one. And we need to add actually to that, to our metrics of analyzing the environmental impact. But yeah, indeed, we have a number of opportunities. Decade of Action on Nutrition, the manifesto is a great opportunity, and we hope that next year at the reconvened Conference of Parties food system will actually be a bit more in the forefront. It's been neglected before, and people didn't want to talk about food system in the previous COPs, but maybe this one is different. And we do have a UN Food System Summit, and many of you are involved in that. We have a Nutrition for Growth event. So yeah, the opportunities are there, but how to seize them? And I'd like to say that Professor Webb has a number of points that we would like to perhaps ask question about. I'm just watching the chat box for you to ask questions. We also have Tom Arnold. Welcome, Tom. Tom is a chair of a task force on rural Africa established by the European Commission, and is a former Director General of the Institute of International and European Affairs, and he's also been part of the global panel. So, he can answer your questions. But perhaps I will start with a couple of questions to Patrick. First one, Patrick, you said in part consumers for informed choice, and definitely consumer choice is critical. But we always have known that you need to have a food environment which is supportive of those choices.
Mm-hmm.
Your priority actions are somehow hinting at that. Can you expand a little bit? I mean, to what extent we've actually been neglecting, behavioral change interventions, nudges? To what extent, the investment in changed food environment, and I purposely use the word investment, financial investment. Are they of equal importance? Which one comes first? The chicken or the egg? Patrick.
Oh, definitely the egg. Yeah, that's of course a very, very important question, because we have to start. The transition starts with what we have, and what we have is not working terribly well, and is established in such a way that, well, it does what it was intended to do based on economic and political agendas of the past 100 years, let's say. What it's not designed to do is to think outwards to the next 100 years and what needs to change, what could be done differently to achieve the health goals and what Christina was pointing out, the environmental and biodiversity and climate goals. The problem is we're all acting a little bit like deer in the headlights. It's such a complex challenge with so many different dimensions that everyone's kind of looking, okay, who's going to go first? Who's going to take that first step? And this is really important when you talk about business and private sector interests. There is no incentive actually for any large firm or company or business to take the first step whereby they may lose market share or profit for their shareholders, right? There's a real dilemma there. And in fact, the Global Panel and I were talking with a consortium of large international companies yesterday, and they were very, very clear about that, very cognizant of the fact that they need to think and act differently, but challenged, and they were openly admitting it, in figuring out what to do first, how and who should act, right? So I think part of the developing of the narrative is that it's not impossible, it's not impossibly complex. Break it down into the small pieces, the small steps that we each can do, and let's figure out how to incentivize and reward small steps. It doesn't have to be radical transformation all at once. Now that may sound like I'm downplaying urgency. It's not. It's supremely urgent that radical things happen. But we can't, we can't stop transformation from happening by being stuck at the first transition steps. We have to, that's part of what I was saying about not just shaping the narrative, but shaping evidence to support that narrative and generating evidence of best practice and disseminating best practice in terms of even small things, even groupings, clusters of activities that together can make a cascade of positive effects. So I think that's why I started in those quadrants with the desirability quadrant, which is about the food environment. I think from the health lens, that's where we all need to be thinking. From the agriculture lens, it's a different quadrant. They are linked. The dialogues have to be connected. But they are different kinds of steps. We just have to make sure those steps are coordinated, that policies and investments are not counteracting each other, and that the benefits are well documented and then shared. Then we have a basis to go forward.
Thanks, Patrick. That's clear. Talking about who should take this first steps, and Stefan Pettersen asks about the work of international and national institutions. And she, rightly says, okay, how should we change our behavior? And then he also asks about governance. Do we have, better governance tool to work together between department sectors and align our efforts towards a better multi-sectoral integration? Do you have any thoughts about that? And actually, I would like to ask Tom also to come in on that, because he's been at the heart of one of these probably successful attempts, I would say, to integrate. Patrick and then Tom, please.
Oh, Tom will be much more eloquent on this one, because Stefan is asking a very key question. And it goes to what I was suggesting about incentives or disincentives for working differently. And that definitely applies to our own institutions. And what do we get rewarded for? And typically, the old way of working, we don't get rewarded for reaching across sectors, across institutions, across disciplines. Academia is perhaps one of the worst to blame in that regard, but it applies to UN agencies and corporate businesses as well. We need to, this requires leadership at the top of the UN institutions, the top of businesses, the CEOs. They have to articulate very clearly that they want to reward not business as usual, and they want to reward acting differently towards other kinds of common agendas. But Tom, what's your experience in thinking there?
Patrick, great to see you. Well, I think the emphasis you have put today, and indeed the report puts on the concept of transition towards ultimate transformation, is hugely important. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that we all across the world at this stage of the deteriorating problem, the situation getting worse in terms of the large increase in obesity, the connection with non-communicable diseases, and the consequent costs in terms of public finances and in terms of health systems dealing with it. And yet, despite all that evidence, that has not triggered a sufficient acceptance at national level in many cases for action. And I mean, that's the key issue. So I would maybe put the proposition that we are in the immediate post-COVID era moving into a moment of opportunity where there is perhaps a recognition that we're going to have to invest more in health systems over a longer time frame. And we also have next year the Food System Summit. And here we have a chance of connecting the international and the national. But there are very real issues at national level. And one of the other things that I'm doing at the moment is I'm chairing an exercise in Ireland called the 2030 Agri-Food Strategy. It's basically to chart a vision for the agri-food strategy up to 2030. And this is probably about the fourth or fifth such strategy since 2000. And it's largely driven by the agri-food sector. But on this occasion, we are adopting a food systems approach, and we are saying specifically that this sector, for the agri-food sector for the next decade, has to explicitly take health into account. But this is the first time this has happened. And and I don't think Ireland is an outlier here at all. When at the beginning of this session, I began to pose the question, well, what about the connections between food and health? What about the relationships between the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Health? Lo and behold, one finds that there is very little structured relationship or joined up thinking. And that, I think, is a real issue, and it's an issue in many, many countries. So I think what we perhaps need over the next year is to work towards a much more general understanding that food and health is a really important political and public policy issue. And that needs to translate into some form of political recognition of that, and then start the process of movement. And you have to start, as Patrick says, from where you are, and that you have to identify the early steps as to where you can get things that are sensible to link up with each other, where you can get synergies, where you can get public health benefit, and you start on the journey. But in many countries, we have not started on that journey. So there's two elements. There's getting a political vision that this is an important issue, and then at a more practical level, getting leadership with key stakeholders to say, can we agree on what the first steps in this journey should be, and let's get on with it. Thank you, Francesco.
Thank you, Tom. You've partially responded to a question that Lena asked, and the question is, what would you suggest is key to ensure that health is central in the Food System Summit? We do have the feeling that, you know, health seems to be a little bit of an afterthought. Yeah, sustainability, because we talk about it, you know, after all, the economic is what is driving everything. I mean, unless we have the economics, and yeah, health, you know, if we can get health, that's good, but it's not the main driver. But while you think about that, I'd like to ask Quesuru, and she's always saying, we keep talking about the need to change and influence food system to create enabling food environment to promote healthy diets, but is taking some sort of bold action to address the issue of changing food supply chain, which is
Uh-oh. Why don't I, okay, in the interest of time, and assuming Francesco manages to come back, let me just offer.
Yes, hi Patrick, this is
yeah,
Tizera. I can finish the question.
No, I read it, it's okay.
Okay, good, thank you.
So I'll respond to those two questions, and maybe either maybe Tom or Christina could come in. So yeah, yes, bold actions have to happen elsewhere in the food system, no question about that. And but we need more evidence actually on this issue of long versus short supply chains. And you know, one reason being that a lot of the sodium and sugar and TFAs are, you know, the ultra processed food and packaged foods. A lot of them are actually being produced and distributed in and from middle income and low income countries themselves, right? It's not just the transnational corporations. There are large companies in Latin America and South Africa, and certainly in Asia that are generating, they're not part of the Walmarts and the Carrefours. They are essentially local and regional companies that generate a lot of the problem foods that are consumed locally. So, and those are part of short supply chains. So we need a little bit more attention to that. On the quickly on the question of bringing health into the Food System Summit, I would argue personally is that we have to keep on focusing on quality of diet. Keep on focusing on high quality diet as the core element within a food system that links all the other pieces and is both either the problem or the solution to both human and planetary health simultaneously. So we have to not just talk about food, but affordable, desirable, high quality, sustainable diets. The word diet has to be the Trojan horse to get to this. Tom?
Okay, you mentioned consensus. You said, you know, we you know, among how to engage the stakeholders, you know, support intergovernmental global initiative, and you need to have consensus. But in reality, we know that for some of the areas, you know, you mentioned about the, you know, in the desirability marketing, there's no consensus on marketing. How can you get consensus from the marketeers, from the big multinationals on curbing that marketing? There are areas where, you know, there's no win-win. Somebody wins and somebody loses.
Well, yes. So it depends whether it's the profit motive that wins or the health outcome that wins, right? Of course, I'm exaggerating. No, the consensus, of course, is not always totally agreed. but the science is often ignored or distorted. I think that's really what I meant, is that there has to be both rigor in the research and credibility and authority in the translation of science into recommended policy actions. And there is growing evidence now, for one example being subsidies on sugar sweetened beverages, for example, or the effectiveness of front of package labeling, for example, even in middle income countries. So it doesn't matter how contested that becomes on the basis of commercial interest. The science behind those empirical studies has to be backed, has to be supported and said, no, this is credible evidence, and it's evidence that can be shared and tested in other settings. So that really, maybe consensus is a step too far, but agreement around what is solid evidence on which to work, I think has to have the backing of authority, for example, like WHO.
Okay, well, that's great to work with you, such an untractable optimist, Patrick. Christina, what should we do to bring this discussion to the COP?
I think that this discussion will necessarily have to go to the COP. I mean, we've seen how much health has catalyzed action, the power it has to catalyze complete transformative change, right? So I think that health needs to be at the center of this discussion, and in particular, in relation to food systems and healthy diets. I also think that a lot of the points that were raised by Patrick and others are highly valuable. We really need to engage cross-sectorally. We can't possibly emphasize that enough. We very recently published WHO guidance, for instance. I didn't mention it before, but we very recently published WHO guidance on mainstreaming biodiversity for nutrition and health. And if you're looking at that report, you can see that it really is the result of cross-sectoral action. And it really does help to target measures, not only looking at one sector in isolation, but looking at this as a whole big picture, looking at some of the points that were raised here, promoting indigenous crop varieties, high in nutritional value, improving sustainable post-harvest methods, developing national food-based dietary guidelines, removing perverse economic incentives, promoting the role of education, actually, as well, supporting traditional food cultures, which we haven't had much of a chance to discuss here, but that are also foundations of health and well-being. If you look at these and so many others that we outlined there, that are outlined in this report, that are outlined through the WHO work, it really helps to bring health at the forefront. I think there's not only an opportunity for leadership, I think there's also an imperative to have it, and not only in COP, but in various international fora. And maybe one last point, sorry, Francesco, maybe one last point. Before, somebody had mentioned that, there really is an opportunity to connect the international with the national. But to that, I want to add, connecting the international to the national isn't sufficient. We really need to get to the local, because it's at the local level that you're really at the forefront of natural resource management. It's really where you are most vulnerable of the repercussions of what is happening at the national and international level. So thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And let me give the last word to Tom, actually. So I'm impressed, and I wonder whether we could use actually the 2030 agri-food strategy in Ireland as an example of mainstreaming health, and really something that we might profile in the Food System Summit. But your word of wisdom, how can we profile better health? What are the leverage? I mean, you talked about key stakeholders. Imagine you're also talking about potential champions. How would you do that?
Well, I think after hopefully countries and the world begins to see COVID on a decline, on a steady decline, there's going to have to be a moment of reflection to see what have we learned from this experience and how can we build that learning into the future. And a central part of that learning is going to have to be that the world in general takes health more seriously. The world in general values the people who work in health. We all had a sense of that a few months ago. And where do you take that? Where does that dawning, where does that realization take you? I think it means that there has to be high-level political recognition of that, both at international level and at national level. And then if you have that, you work down from there. And then you're back into exactly the messages that Patrick identifies. What are the first steps to take? Who needs to be involved? It has to be not just a whole of government approach, but actually a whole of society approach. And that means education. That means awareness raising among the public. And Patrick is quite right. Healthy diets is at the heart of this dialogue. So Francesco, that's how I would summarize at the end of what has been a very good and productive hour of discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, and really great summary for what I think it's been a very stimulating also set recommendation for WHO and partners. We have a number of partners that are going to work with us on the food system transformation. I appreciate that we haven't replied to one key question that was raised in the chat. It was, how do you build a healthy food system? That's probably what, first of all, let's read the report. There's a lot in there that can answer that question. That's going to be the discussion of the Food System Summit. We all appreciate this role for us. There are small steps for big achievements. We have to be optimistic. We are an important stakeholder, and bringing health in the Food System Summit is definitely our mission. So we'll continue this discussion. So thank you very much again, Patrick, Tom, Christina, for being with us this afternoon, and looking forward further discussion on this important issue.
Very good. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.